and they left us unharmed. The next morning, I saw commotion in the house, and they took all the security personnel to interrogate them on why and how they came in. The Israeli commandos came in our house. And there was one of the soldiers, his name was Abdul Halim, and he was very dear to us because he always played with us. He always took us in the truck to the beach in Gaza and got us candy. And he never came back with the rest of the soldiers. And we all asked, where's Abdul Halim? And we were told he was killed during interrogation. So we were living in a war zone as children. And I remember going to school when the fighting was really intense. We used to go to school in a jeep with 2 or 3 soldiers around us with machine guns to protect us. So it was just a very, very risky situation for children, especially. And we were not the only Egyptian children in Gaza. There were children of other Egyptian soldiers as well, and officers. And it's a situation I wouldn't want any kid to grow up in. I went to Gaza elementary schools, and of course we learned pure hatred for Jews. Even our songs were songs of hate. Every day, every morning, there has to be poetry recital in the class, and we were forced to memorize by heart all this poetry. The poetry was about jihad, about killing Jews, about dying, us children dying as martyrs, about how proud we are of our jihad. And we had to memorize it by heart. And one day I forgot, I just could not memorize it. And the principal took me to her office, put the poetry book in front of me and said, you have to remember it, and close the door. And every half hour she would come back, and I still cannot remember it. I could not memorize it. It was just, had a block. And I remember at the end of the day, I was supposed to go home, and she actually hit my hand with a ruler. To how dare I not memorize jihadist poetry? And when we were reciting this kind of poetry in the classroom, the girls were very emotional. When they recited the poetry, they would cry, and it was very emotional, very powerful on us as children to see children crying like that and blaming Jews for everything in the poetry. And that was very, very powerful because it made us feel anybody who would make children cry that much must be very bad. So Jews must be very bad, even though we never saw Jews.
When was the first time you saw a Jew?
There were a few Jews in Egypt even after the 56 war, but they never told us they were Jews. Apparently, there was a couple of girls at the American University in Cairo who were Jewish. I never knew they were Jewish. And suddenly, one of them disappeared, just didn't come anymore, even though she didn't graduate. Lo and behold, I was in California about a couple of years ago in a group called Jimena. And Jimena is Middle Eastern Jews getting together in America. And I saw a woman who looked familiar. She was my age. And she saw me and we asked, were you at the American University in Cairo? Because I knew she was an Egyptian Jew. And she turned out to be that. I remembered the young girl right away. And she told me her story. that her fiancé and all his male relatives after the 67 war were in jail. And she didn't tell anybody in the university. It was almost a shame to tell anybody that they were suffering that much. Gamal Abdel Nasser put the few Jews left in Egypt in jail. And then I thought at that time that she was Christian. I didn't know she was Jewish. And then suddenly, lo and behold, I meet Jews who were existing in Egypt, but I never knew they were Jews. But the first time I really met and interacted with Jews when I moved to the United States in '78. I was 30 years old when I met for the first time a Jewish person.
Really, the next thing I wanted to know was what it was like growing up in Nasser's Egypt, and here's what she said about that.
The time of Nasser was very harsh, very oppressive. He ruled like a dictator. It was a police state. My father, who was supposed to be the head of the Egyptian intelligence after maybe perhaps a few weeks after his death, if he had survived, didn't get the promotion. And the person who got his position was our neighbor. His name was Salah Nasr. So people who used to visit us, because Salah Nasr, just his name, used to scare people in Egypt. People who used to visit us used to be scared just to be that close to the head of the intelligence of Egypt. It was a time when the Muslim Brotherhood was attempting to kill Nasser in '55, and he put many of them in jail. And the Muslim Brotherhood practically ended by Nasser. He was very tyrannical. And I observed in Egypt a lot of poverty, which struck me even worse poverty than Gaza. I remember once I asked my mom, we used to think Palestinian refugees are poor, but there's more poverty in Egypt. And over there, it was because of the Jews, but what about in Egypt? And she was speechless. She couldn't understand. We couldn't see why. The poverty was widespread in the Middle East, despite of the wealth from oil. It still exists in many large areas of the Middle East.
How did the culture change in Egypt after the Jews were expelled around the time that Israel was formed?
When the Jewish people especially left the country, the culture changed. They were an asset to the Egyptian culture. The arts, the movies, the businesses, the talent, a lot of talent in Egypt was gone. And this was not just a loss to the Jewish people, it was a loss to Egypt. The departure of the good talents of all these minorities, especially the Jewish people, really hurt Egypt.
Can you please tell us about your father?
Yeah, I always grew up with my father being portrayed as he was very excited about Fidaiyin. He started it. Many Egyptians came to congratulate us after his death, like, your father, was responsible for killing over 1,800 Jews, and congratulations, he's a hero. So in my mind, there was always the impression that my father kind of liked his job. But when I looked at that book and I saw that my father initially, according to a document that was seized in my father's office, the intelligence office, he did warn the Egyptian government that the Fidaiyin operation is going to cause unrest and it's going to cause turmoil between on the borders with Israel.